be held.
Hey, cool. Thanks, guys. I'm Jared. I'm the MC for this evening. Tonight we have Michael Davies from Anchor discussing website performance, and 2 lightning talks with Peter Cooper from Sydstart and Peter Cooper from Sydstart and Stephen Cooper. Y'all confuse me with this in PayPal and Braintree. Just a quick note: male bathrooms are right there, directly behind you, and women's bathroom right around the corner to the left. Also, pizza will be around here from about 8 p.m., so please wait for the pizza. And please drink, okay? There's plenty of alcohol there for you, so drink as much as you want. Coke, water, soda, there you go. All right. Thanks to our sponsor, Anchor, kick-ass hosting. Probably one of the only hosting providers I actually recommend here in Australia. Reinteractive, kick-ass Ruby on Rails developers. If you know anything about Ruby on Rails, please go see Chloe. Chloe, who's here from Anchor? Let's do this drill again. Anchor, people, please raise your hands. There we go. And General Assembly, their campus for technology design and entrepreneurship. Okay, AWIA, I keep stressing this, always stressing this, please go to the site, please register, please join if you can, very inexpensive to join. Australian Web Industry Awards. Australian Awards is a showcase of outstanding work of web designers and developers. Submissions for the awards are accepted until August. So if it validates, accessible, and is good, submit it. And it's also looking good for the judges. This range from categories you can select from. Go to the site for more details. Please see Jess if you have any questions. Jess, you can raise a little. Okay. Cool. And also, again, AWIA is always looking for new members. They're the reason why we're here today, having these speed talks, power talks, and also for you to collaborate within the tech professions. Okay. Meetup groups. Ruby on Rails, Oceana Sydney, speak to Chloe. Swag, I love that. Sydney Web Apps Group, speak to David Lewis. David here? Lewis? No? I know Dave Clark is here. Sid
Jack.
PHP, where you, Dave, where you at?
Jack, I'm
Jack.
the other co-organizer of both
Okay,
groups.
Jack is here. Sid PHP, group formation, exclamation. ZF, Zen Framework, Sydney User Group, Sydney Mobile Development Group, DevOps, Sydney, Free Sydney Speed Networking, Sydney Tech Startup Meetup, and Stackers. I want to stress this, the meetup groups aren't just for you to have drinks, free drinks and free food. It's for you to network with people in your professions. A good example is for Sid PHP. If you're a PHP developer and you need help, this is a good way for you to network with people within the industry. If you need script, you need a job, this is the best way for you to actually do. If you're in sales, this is the best way for you to actually make some money. To see what's that, I'm serious. It's the easiest way to make sales is networking, not just going out there going customer to customer, and also get to know your industry. Hiring announcements, Anchor, Linux system admins, technical account manager, customer service, and Haskell. I still don't know what that is. Sounds like a cartoon or something. And Reinteractive, looking for Ruby on Rails developers. Please see just for Anchor for any of these positions, and also for Reinteractive, please see Chloe. And you know somebody who needs a job, everyone does. Okay, now to begin with the lightning talks. Peter Cooper.
Do I have time for another beer?
Stop.
No,
Cool, I'll hand it over to Peter.
Hi everyone. I didn't know what sort of audience it was tonight, other than fairly technical audience, and I really don't like doing advertising, right? So I hate selling. I really don't like selling, and so I just thought I'd sort of tell you a bit of a story and see what you think and see whether you enjoy it or not. But basically, Sydstart started as a hobby, right? So I did computer science at UTS and seemed to go okay, and got working second year doing programming pretty badly, and then got headhunted to the stock exchange and worked on the trading system there in the early days, and then got a bit interested in real-time programming, and still not very good at it. They gave me the market control function for the centrepiece of the Australian economy. I've stuffed up a few times. But that went okay, and then we did the options market the following year, and that went okay, and they worked for 20 years, so 19 years and 21 years, I think. And then they bought some international product and brought it in, and that sort of works better now, they reckon. And I got headhunted to work for another company, Rothschilds, and did some programming for them, and under my supervision, some of our most talented contractors deleted 250,000 customers' names. So yeah, you don't look to me for technology credentials, okay? Or arguably business credentials. But I do really care about Sydney, because I live here and I've got kids and stuff, and I'm not doing that from a parochial point of view, because I've travelled heaps. I've lived and worked in 20 countries, and sold 2 businesses, totaled 100 million, and I didn't have the whole thing, I just had a little tiny slice. But what all that work and a lot of other work has done is basically show to me that Australia has the ability to be not just world class but world leading. Okay, and Anchor is probably an example of that. I think bunch of typically understated, technically amazing, proficient people that never ring their own bell. You know, they just keep doing good stuff for the community, from buying beer stores to events. And Andrew Rogers, one of the founders, has been sponsoring Sydstart since like way early days, and it's continued more recently, and it's been fantastic. What it is instead of trying to be a little bit of great example of what I was talking about. We can give that one, but it's nothing else. What Sydstart is just a way of trying to pull together the community. Okay, so get your hyper connected in the broadest sense of startups, and maybe get a little bit inspired. Not just by salesy people that are really good at telling a story, or Tony Robbins types that are really good at getting you to jump up on chairs, but real people like Mike Campbellton, Lassian, and Andrew from Anchor, and Matt Barry from Freelance, that have built globally successful, globally significant businesses. Okay, and this is where the junction of your profession as technologists and impact on the world happens. You can be the best Haskell. We're going to pick on Haskell tonight. You can be the best Haskell expert and still miss having real impact and satisfaction in your work if you can't find the hustler, the business person, or the operations and sales person, or the hipster, in my language, the designer, the user experience specialist, to bring together and make a great startup. So I think that's one of the great things that's happening globally right now. I did some rough numbers the other day, and I just picked 25 businesses that wouldn't exist, or their core product and revenue streams wouldn't exist without the internet. And the number came up to 2.6 trillion. It's probably close to 3 trillion. So it's kind of special, because it's also at the same time that we've got 3 billion people coming on the web, and it ties back to Sydney a little bit, in the sense that you say, okay, why is Sydney important? Okay, so Sydney wasn't even on the map globally 4 years ago. Okay, so I've been going around, and a lot of other people have also been going around volunteering, finding gaps in the ecosystem, and saying, okay, we need co-working spaces, we need more investor awareness, we need policy, we need more people connected, And I think maybe in some ways this might be a junction point in history, because Sydney has become significant, right? How many startups in Sydney, or in Australia? Actually, let's go for Australian numbers. How many startups in Australia?
Not enough.
Not enough, yeah, good answer.
10 more than in Sydney.
Okay, yeah, so that's a really good point. So Melbourne is about 30% smaller than Sydney on current stats, rough stats. And there's a lot of contradictory information out there. The Google-sponsored Startup Oz initiatives used to say 1,500, now they're saying 1,000. Microsoft BizSpark, BizTalk, whatever it's called, BizSpark, is 2,400. Sydstart says 5,000. AngelList, which has got varying data quality, like all of them, probably 1,500. So yeah, it's between 1,000 and 2,000 probably. You know. Who here has done a project which they think could be a startup? I hope half the room. Yeah. And who's working in a startup now? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Who's got startups as customers? So, what's a special? I put that's a short form resume. Sydstart. That's a long form resume, which is a little bit dry, but we'll talk about that another time. What's interesting is that I think we have if we've got $3 trillion worth in the top 25 startups, internet-enabled large businesses now, and $3 billion on the web by the end of the year. What's special about Sydney is we're the largest, most international city in Australia, with 150 languages on the east coast of Australia. So there's a kind of weird junction point between multiple economies and multiple cultures that we don't realise. You know, you walk down the street and you hear it, and you're talking to people, whatever. But it's actually quite a unique, special time. We've got some really international universities and really international businesses here as well, both multinational and homegrown. And so what we're trying to do for Sydstart is bring them all together. And we have a morning where people hear the globally successful ones. We have a middle of the day when you hear about all the new community initiatives that are going on. So it might be, you know, whether it's conferences or new startups or new community working space or new education opportunity, new meetup groups. And then in the afternoon we have a pitching competition. And the pitching competition is not like your average pitching competition. So we've had something like 150 companies apply, which is roughly 10% of the market, and say we want to compete to be in the top 10. And only the top 10 pitch in the afternoon. The other 140 have competed at the stock exchange over a series of 3 or 4 days to get screened out, and we've got, you know, really amazingly world-class judges giving them feedback and talking to them and listening to them and trying to be helpful. It's not about the competition. It's about the promotion opportunities. It's about the networking opportunity. It's about the feedback. You know, it's about practical advice and connections. So yeah, I was going to talk about a whole bunch of things, but I just thought, you know, it's probably more interesting to just hear the story, and so that's where we're at. And so far, we think we've helped about 5,000 people by the end of this year. And the question is now, where does the community go from here? So what started as a hobby has become the biggest, and we've got to decide what to do with it. So it'd be interesting if you can. It's on the 2nd of September. We've got a couple of lead-up events, one at the end of July and on the 31st of July. And we're targeting just tech startups, right? So where the world gets a bit confusing is, you know, you're doing lots of enterprise IT, and you might be sort of, you know, serving corporates and serving large businesses, or digital creative, where you might be doing campaign-based work, once again servicing enterprise, not as staff but as external providers. But tech startups are really special because we're trying to compete in a lot of ways, or disrupt. Okay, so Clayton Christensen is a guy from Harvard, he's a professor. He wrote a book called Innovator's Dilemma, and he also coined the term disruptive innovation. You hear a lot of politicians and policy people talk about it, and educators as well, but they forget about the basic reason, meaning for that, and of disruptive innovation. And it's doing something fundamentally different. So who uses Microsoft Word? It's an old story, so just go with me on it. Who uses Microsoft Word? Okay, who uses Google Docs? Okay. So what Google Docs is doing to Word, and why they've responded with their other online products, is because it's just, you know, a smaller feature set that more accurately matches what the user wants, powered by the web. Okay, and the web is just one disruptive technology. Great SaaS products are just another example of applying that. And the good tech startups are actually being disruptive. So they're using marketplaces, or they're using focused feature sets. And there's a bunch of trends I'll talk about in a sec, but it's really about disrupting. So they might have enterprises customers, but they're really potentially disrupting them. And you know, we're all seeing what Uber's doing to the taxi industry. globally, and it's applied in lots of other smaller ways. So there's overlaps, of course, and core technologies at the core, but there is, the language is different. And you'll hear it took 25 years for government to learn the language of IT, and they just started calling it IT. And then they more recently they started saying, oh yeah, the digital industry, because they finally worked out there is a digital industry. So over the next probably 3 years, it's happening faster than I hope, which is good. But they'll finally start learning the specific language of startups, and as professionals, we owe it to them to be able to explain to them that it is fundamentally different. Okay, sure, we've got tech in common, and we've got an internal entrepreneur or intrapreneur experience, and there's consistency, and pretty much not disrupting. We're doing what we're told as suppliers, sustaining innovation. Cool new app, doing what I'm told, building for the enterprise, or disruptive innovation, fundamentally competing with them because it's actually good in the long term for the economy. Sustaining innovation tends to kill jobs in the short term and flat in the long term. Disruptive innovation definitely creates jobs in the short and medium term. It might kill it in the long term. Technology generally kills jobs. That's why we have to get educated. So who's heard of CB Insights? Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so I thought there'd be at least 10% of the room know about CB Insights. CB Insights is a data analytics play that sucks data out of the Crunchbase data, and it gives you really deep analytics on how companies have got, customers and funding and all that sort of stuff. Mary Meeker, has anyone heard of Mary Meeker? No? Yeah, so Mary's produces the most definitive research on internet services. So when you write your app or you write your website and you're looking at the built with analytics or the Google Analytics and you're seeing how it's used, what her data is telling you is the trends way before the customers get to your site or to your app. She'll be telling you the trends in adoption that you can use to anticipate. And if you're in infrastructure, you can use that data to anticipate your infrastructure investments. If you're in consumer or enterprise, you can use it to tailor for the particular micro segments of iOS users or Android users, so where Sydstart comes in is basically just trying to be another useful source of data. But rather than individual groups, we try to be the crossover point. So you actually bring them all together, and we're just about really getting hyper-connected, because if you're hyper-connected, you learn faster, and the good stuff goes up faster. The bad stuff gets found out, and you tell everyone. Not just within your meetup groups, because we still have the meetup groups hosted there as well, but more broadly. And maybe get a little bit inspired by people who've done stuff, but also educated. And surprisingly enough, those themes are echoed by all the major conferences globally. We didn't come up with those by copying, we came up with them independently, but it's become a global trend. So South by Southwest is sort of 40, 50,000, launches about 5,000. I couldn't tell you how big the web is, but it's probably about 10,000. So in our own backyard, we've got something significant. And just to give you a feel for how big, this is one VC in the US. And you can see this metric only goes to about 100 million. That's their buyers, right? They're buying companies, investing in companies. These are their exits, and you can see the metric here goes to adds a zero every notch. So you can see that the majority of exits are trade sales, and there's a few IPOs on the stock exchange, but it's pretty much an order of magnitude or two from investment to exit. And this is it's a global phenomenon. It's hubbed out of the US, but we are uniquely positioned with Asia and with our strong axes with the US and Europe. And it's easy to forget that we've got a structural advantage. We've just got to make sure we use it. Someone once told me, I don't know if he's still doing it, but the GitHub operational management was done by Anchor at one stage. Yeah, so great example. Good time zone. What are the next 10 like that? There's huge opportunities. They're the big industries that are getting the investment, and this is the stuff that we'll cover. So 2/3 is going to consumer. 2/3 is going to enterprise by quantity. 1/3 is the consumer, but by value, it's 1/3, less than 1/3 enterprise and 2/3 consumer. So if you're doing a startup or you're looking to invest or work in one or have them as customers, if you want to play the numbers game, the long tail, go into enterprise. If you want to get the outlying unicorn, great great customer. It's probably in the consumer space. I'll just wrap up, but a couple of observations that have come through in all the screening that we've done from the hundreds of startups that we've been mentoring and pitch coaching and screening. But there's a thing that's, has anyone noticed this trend towards extreme simplicity? So the apps are sort of decomposing the apps and they're breaking it up. We were just talking about it earlier, it came up unprompted in the conversation. So who's on Yo? Who's heard of Yo? Okay, funny, isn't it, right? That's because it's almost crazy that an app would be so simple. You just hit a button and it yo's a mate. It just says yo or whatever, and that's it.
Isn't it a joke?
Huh?
I thought it was a joke.
I thought it was a joke too, but if it's a joke, it's
was
gone
a
viral
joke
as a
to
joke.
see if they could raise money.
I just launched the API. And so once you've got the API, you've got versioning on the API, you start adding content to instead of a heartbeat or a ping, you've got content on the message. And they're a WeChat before you know it. Maybe it's just a customer acquisition game.
Maybe you can buy a potato salad with it later.
Maybe a lot of it, but yeah, it's kind of weird. But Facebook Messenger did the same thing. You've seen it with, has everyone seen Tinder, that dating app? You swipe the faces or whatever. That's now being applied, the same principle, to other things like fashion and commerce and retail products. So yeah, it's kind of weird. And then once you've got that and you know what your customers like and what they use, you can aggregate it on the back end and collect the data and add other features. So the big trend locally has been around that, and I don't think anyone in Australia, frankly, is doing this well yet. This is a global trend that is happening undeniably, but it's not actually being applied very well in Australia. So it's something you might want to think about. Who knows what that is? Dropbox. Yeah. So who doesn't use Dropbox or Box? Oh, okay. Yeah. Interested? What do you use?
I don't.
Copy.com.
My own hard drives.
Yep.
Yeah, so these guys are working on monetization strategies and they're just pretty much going to start adding a zero every time they upgrade you. It's just good market segmentation. They're moving into mainstream infrastructure. They'll be potentially as big as a lot of other whole industries. And here in little old Sydney, all of a sudden in the last 12 months, we've had this rush towards verticalise. So we've got really good edutech meetup groups happening now. I don't know if anyone here got mates or customers in education. There's probably 300 odd in that space. It's become really quite strong. Construction, I didn't realise just how many in the home automation, construction sites, security, tracking, all that sort of stuff. There's probably 50 there. Fashion and design, okay, maybe I'm not the right person talking about this, but there are actually a really big group happening in fashion and design, from bespoke handbags to glasses to shoes to all sorts of stuff. Finance has been long talked about and it is gradually getting momentum. What's probably most interesting is that there's been even a dedicated accelerator pop up in Sydney called AWI. We'll see how it works. One ex-Macquarie Bank director that's incubating that, and there's probably another 15 or 20 in finance. Health's probably bigger, but it's more fragmented at the moment. Family's probably bigger again. There's one startup alone that's got 300,000 actives in health, in family, in Sydney, and it's less than 2 years old. But they're not really talking to each other yet. It's just gradually coming in, and obviously e-commerce has been around and will be around for years. And there's more and more, and they're getting narrower and narrower, more specialised. But it takes a group of about 20 or 30, transport obviously, before you start getting meaningful results in terms of lobbying, policy, awareness, getting media articles, all that sort of stuff. And all I'm trying to do today is give you a little taste of what it would be like if you went to Sydstart. Another one we had a guy from who spent a long time in China working very closely with the startups over there. Give a lightning talk for 20 minutes or so that detailed all the major trends that are happening over there. And then what's interesting is you get to cherry pick. You're thinking, okay, that's irrelevant for Australia, but that is relevant. Well, that's my little startup is here. I'm cycling down the side of the expressway, and that one over there is Uber, and it's going to come down like a Mack truck and open the door on the back of my head and knock me into the gutter on the expressway because I'm just not moving fast enough. It's not funded fast enough, or I'm not big enough, or haven't got the best strategy for technology, whatever. So that's pretty much it. You can come along and have a taste of what's going on. We're expecting about maybe probably 15 finalists, if maybe a bit less, and the quality's amazing. Probably 15 community speakers on little initiatives in the community, and maybe 10 sort of global standard speakers in the morning. About 1,200 people, there's 100 exhibitors. If you can't afford a ticket, ring me, I'll give you one. If you've got a job, you should be able to buy one and subsidise all the costs, because it's run at cost, it's not a for-profit event. So turn up 2nd September, go to the website, check it out. Thanks.
All right, cool. Next we have Stephen Cooper, HPAC, developer evangelist from HPAC and Braintree, and my road dog at Diesel. Hip Diesel.
So I'm here from PayPal and Braintree, the developer evangelist for APAC. I'm coming to tell you about Battlehack, which is the hackathon happening at the end of this month, 26th and 27th of July. So last year we were in 8 countries, this year we're in 13. This is the first time this has been hosted. We've had this event in Australia. Sydney is the first city of Sydney. The idea of the hackathon is to develop an app in 24 hours, either a website or a mobile app, or even an IoT solution, which I'm really geeking out about at the moment. Using that helps charities, match donors, improve public transport planning, anything that does sort of a communal good or community-based good, using, of course, PayPal and Braintree APIs and SDKs. So after 24 hours, your app solution will be judged by a panel of 4 judges. One of them being Tech AU, Jason Cartwright, who I announced a few hours ago. Upon which time 3 winners will be selected. So the third prize is Snapchat for Hipsters, a Polaroid camera. PlayStation 2 for, sorry, PlayStation 4. And first prize, of course, is the trip to the World Finals in Silicon Valley. So we fly the winner, the team of winners or winner, over to San Jose in America. And of course, you get the axe. So this is one of 4, and yeah, I thought it'd be cool to take it around the meetups to show them what you're actually getting. It is a very heavy axe, and everyone's welcome to come and get a picture. I can't show you the trip to America because we haven't had it. So if you want to know more, there's a bit.ly which is available on the meetup website as well. I'm on Twitter or every other social media, even Weibo, as Developer Steve, or you can hit up PayPal Dev. That's it. Any questions? Yeah, I'm happy to do it now, or something after a picture taken with the app.
Please be advised, if you do win, don't take that axe to San Jose, you will get shot. I used to live there, so don't provoke gang violence. Anyway, next we have Michael, who's the system administrator here at Anchor, who specializes in web application performance and optimization. He has a passion for making websites load fast where anything's slower. He's actually, let me just cancel this, he's a really good system administrator. Have any questions, take out your notepad, start taking notes. He can assist you. Anchor is one of the only places that you actually have true system administrator where they can fix the problem actually on the first call. So please take notes, listen, learn, ask questions, network with these guys after the presentation. Thanks.
Hi everyone. So, like Jared said, I'm a system administrator here at Anchor. I work a lot with the most popular web applications, everything from WordPress, Magento, Joomla, Drupal, everything. So let me just get this full screen and we'll get underway. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you guys about caching and how it can help you scale your web application, your blog, your e-commerce site to accommodate getting hit by lots and lots of traffic. It's all about scaling and performance, and arguably they're both sides of the same coin. Before we start discussing how we can use caching, the most important thing to start with is we need to establish a baseline of and to do that we have to measure performance. Sorry if I'm a bit nervous, I haven't done one of these public talks before. If you do have any questions throughout, feel free to let me know and I'll try to answer them as we go. So, what is performance anyway? How do we define whether a website is fast or slow? Do we just click around, browse and see? It can be confounded by all kinds of factors like slow internet, or maybe the problem isn't even in the code on the web server. Maybe it's a problem in JavaScript. We have to work out where that problem is before we can go any further. So generally when we're talking about the performance of the website, we break it down into different categories. One very popular metric is the so-called time to first byte. And essentially that's when someone visits your website and your website starts sending data to whoever visited it. So that's the first visit that someone does. The first visit encompasses everything from the time to first byte up to the page actually loading. And then of course, the repeat visit is someone typically just browsing your website, going from link to link in a normal way that you'd expect someone to browse your website. So we need to identify where the source of the slowness could come from. Whether it's something that's slow on the server side or whether it's something slow on the client side. Generally that's either the web application itself on the server side, so that will be confounded by things like PHP, Node.js, Rails, the choice of database. versus the client side, which is essentially everything that web developers care about in the browser. So, the best thing that I would suggest if you want to take one thing away from this talk is check out Google's great resources on optimizing for performance. Because if anyone knows about making fast websites, it's Google. Google has been pushing this concept of page speed very heavily in the last few years. And they have this excellent tool that you can run your website through online called Page Speed Insights. And it will tell you a rough breakdown of what is slow. Now, if you happen to see this message where it says your server was slow to respond, that is entirely the time to first byte. And that is where caching with Varnish can help you. So first of all, why should we care about a website being slow? I mean, if we're still getting orders, if we're still getting customers, do we need to improve it? But really, we all know people prefer fast websites. And as far as things like search engine optimization goes, Google definitely preferences people with fast websites. You will turn up higher in rankings on pretty much every search engine if your website loads pretty snappily. Even back in 2007, Amazon did a study where they concluded something like it's a 1% decrease in sales for every 0.1 second your site takes to respond. And these days, 7 years later, with faster internet and better browsers and all that, the standards are only getting higher. So you really expect a site to load fast. And you really wouldn't want to be in the shoes of that company from the slide before with 10-second load time, because they're not going to get any sales. So we have to look into what is involved in getting the web page from the server to your visitor's browser. And one simple rule that you can follow is that obviously, if you're trying to do more complex stuff, it makes sense that the page will take longer to render. So I often see problems where sometimes in an e-commerce store, a client really loves to have the show all products button or something like that. And that's always a recipe for disaster, because you can understand if it's showing heaps and heaps of products all on the one page, that'll require extensive database queries, and it takes a while for the page to load. And we definitely want to avoid that. Meanwhile, from the client's perspective, they're clicking around in their browser, and all they see is they click a link, nothing happens. And then maybe in the status bar it shows waiting for server. That's the time to first byte again. And this is where Varnish helps. So I highly recommend using this particular website, webpagetest.org. It allows you to run your website through any number of different browsers in different locations around the world. Essentially, it's just a service that spins up a virtual machine, runs your site through it, and then gives you a breakdown of how slowly it loaded or how quickly it loaded. One of the main things that it has as a metric is the time to first byte. So you can see here an example of a website that takes close to 12 seconds to load before you even get anything in your browser. So that's a pretty bad example. So the concept here, which is why I'm talking to you guys about caching, is that even if you have to make a complicated, complex page, you only have to do that once, really, and then you can cache the result. So the idea behind Varnish is that it is a so-called HTTP accelerator. You can stick it in front of your web server and it will cache things. And I'll explain all the good and bad that comes with that. Now, the good news is with Varnish, if something can be served from the cache, effectively you get a 0 time to first byte. You're only limited by the size of the network pipe, because with Varnish, it's really, really fast. The other side to this is, obviously if you're spending less time to serve a page, that means that all that time that was spent by your server in PHP or MySQL or whatever, generating that page, goes away. So if you can use something like Varnish in order to cache your web application, your e-commerce store, your blog, you'll get much, much lower load on your server. The other flip side is, even if there's things that you can't cache, you'll get lower contention on your server anyway, because if the vast majority of your people can be served from the cache, that reduces the amount that your server has to do, so it's more free to work on other stuff, such as people placing orders. The other reason why Varnish is great is that since it's written primarily with performance in mind, it scales really well. And I'll show you that later. So, comparatively, the same site or a similar site, they're all Magenta sites, behind Varnish would get you a result like this. So you can see here, not only is, this is a sample output from webpagetest.org that I've cropped, but the time to first byte on this one, compared to the large green bar, which took 12 seconds before, not only is it just the very first line with the tiny green vertical line, but that scale is now in milliseconds rather than seconds. Well, not milliseconds, but 0.1 seconds. So you can see just how little time is spent to render the page if it's served from Varnish. And of course this means that you're going to get a higher conversion rate in your store, because people aren't getting annoyed that your server takes so long to load. So, a lot of people are suspicious of things like Varnish because they feel like, I've had this conversation with some developers where they feel like they don't need a caching solution. They can just write better code. They can surely just make the server better. But at scale, that kind of breaks down, because unfortunately, when you're dealing with things like MySQL or PHP, when you start to talk about scaling up to like 1,000 connections per second, or 10,000, or imagine if you're getting on the scale of Twitter, Facebook, Google. We all hope to get something on that scale. That's the dream. But yeah, this kind of technology kind of breaks down if you don't have some kind of caching involved to save yourself from doing unnecessary work. So, the most important thing to establish whether or not Varnish can help you scale is that obviously you have to do some load testing. Now, load testing can take many forms, but typically the easiest thing to do these days is use a load testing service like Blitz.io. It's a very useful website where you can basically say, I want 1,000 people to hit my website on the front page over the next 60 seconds. And it will ramp it up, and you can see if your site survives. And for the vast majority of sites, it's actually pretty bleak. They don't stand up to heavy load well at all. I mean, even if the server is pretty snappy when only 1 or 2 people are testing it, performance problems might not show up until you're in production and suddenly everything's, grinding to a halt because you're getting hit by, your site got linked on Reddit or Twitter or something and everyone's hitting the site at the same time. So in order to help you scale for this, modern age of the web, you need to have some concept of caching, and Varnish is perfect for this. The other thing is, when you look at those, the results that Blitz.io gives you, you can see the average response time that someone visiting your site will get. And often what you see with a typical application is more users visit the site and the response time goes up, because the workers, all the PHP and all that are busy, and there's simply, they have to deal with more people, so it takes more time before you get a response. But you actually see a really interesting difference when you use caching, like varnish, because essentially you get a flat line where no matter if you're getting hit by 10 users or 10,000 users, you'll still get a consistent response time of like practically instant. So, it's all well and good to discuss caching as a panacea to like fix everything, but caching kind of breaks down when we consider that for a lot of websites, people have, essentially they're called sessions. So that will be things like adding things to your shopping cart or logging in. And it'll be the same page with the same URL, but we want to show different content to different people. You don't want someone to add something to their shopping cart and the next thing you know, they go to another page and their items disappear from the shopping cart. So you have to keep that in mind when you're designing your application or your e-commerce store to work with caching in mind. The main thing that we have to determine here is what content is dynamic, what content is per user, and what could just be common for everyone. So, some of the ways that caching can fail pretty terribly would be, consider what would happen if you were to be too aggressive with your caching and you served content from someone else to somebody else. So imagine, like, it could be pretty benign, like maybe the website says, "Hello Michael," and you're not Michael, you haven't logged in yet. That wouldn't really matter too much, you'd think. But it can very, very quickly become even a legal nightmare if you consider what could happen with certain websites. Imagine, for instance, if a bank was trying to implement some kind of caching and then they show you someone else's account. That's not going to end well. So it's much better when you're dealing with any kind of server-side caching like this to be quite conservative, because it's a lot better to be on the safe side and not serve something from the cache, and it's a bit slower, than it is to serve something from the cache and it was actually somebody else's session. So another problem that you can have with when caching is involved is you try to do a new deploy or you try to update a product and nothing happens. You're sure you've updated it, but the change isn't appearing. That's kind of the point of caching, but it's caching too well. So we need some way to invalidate the cache, to update it with the new content. So this is very important because imagine if you had, say, an e-commerce site and you wanted to have a sale. You don't want to show the customer the page with the wrong price on it and then they go, what's going on, when they get charged the wrong amount. So it's very important to make sure that if you make changes, that your content gets invalidated. So, the main thing to realise when you're designing a site for with caching in mind is that for the vast majority of websites, you can generally split them up into distinct sections. And some of them are going to be the same for every user, and some of them are going to be, so that would be things like the menu bar, the sidebar, the header and the footer, a logo. And then other content will be dynamic. Other content will be per user or per session. So that will be things like the shopping cart or anything like that. Any personalization or user account kind of thing. So there are two totally different but complicated methods to deal with this. The first one is the more web developer-y approach to it, which is the use of JavaScript. So you load the page, and then anything that's dynamic gets included with Ajax. I have no idea how it works, but web developers can work some magic with Ajax in order to load dynamic content. That way, the vast majority of the page still looks the same to varnish, so it can still be served safely from the cache. The other alternative is to use what's called edge-side includes, and essentially you can get varnish to stitch together a page made out of different components. So that way you can have things like your menu block, your header, your footer, and then those can be combined with a separate thing that isn't cached, like personalization, shopping cart, things like that. This way you get the best of both worlds in that the page still loads a lot quicker than if you didn't have caching, but the dynamic content is still dynamic and split up per user. So cache and validation is an incredibly important topic. Everything that gets added to the cache, so a web page or a web page or a part of a web page or whatever, has a what's called a TTL, time to live, how long it should be held in the cache for. And one technique that you could use is you could just set it for like an hour, and then you could say to the client, well, changes will take an hour to show up. That's not really a solution, because not only will that mean you'll get a low hit rate, because once an hour goes by, people will start getting the uncached page. It also means that you need to worry still about all the problems with things being inconsistent that I mentioned before. So obviously the best answer is we want things to be in the cache for as long as possible. So we want to set a high TTL. But we want changes to be reflected immediately. And the only way to do that is with cache and validation. Now, in order to achieve a system that works properly with cache and validation, you will need integration with your application. So, for instance, if you had a WordPress site and you made a new post, you would want, as part of the WordPress plugin, to inform Varnish that this page should be purged from the cache. Likewise, if you have a e-commerce site or whatever, you make a change to a product, you update prices, you update images or whatever. You want Varnish to invalidate those items from the cache so that your changes actually show up. There's lots of different Varnish integrations with varying levels of puns as far as the name goes. Node.js people are a bit uncreative. Anyway, as far as other issues go, when you start having a cache involved, if you're relying on things like access logs, that can be a bit tricky, because suddenly your web server won't actually see any request because it gets served by Varnish. So you can get fragmented access logs. And another problem is that Varnish itself doesn't do SSL, and that's by design. But here at Anchor, we found the best solution to both was just chuck Nginx in front of it, and it works great. Essentially, that gives us the front Nginx that has all the access logs and does the SSL termination, and then we can just proxy pass to Varnish, which handles everything as far as caching goes. So, with Varnish, you can also do some tricks in order to increase your cache hit rate. One of the best things that I found was something that sorts the actual query stream. This is excellent because imagine if you had an e-commerce site, and the e-commerce site has different sections. So you might say, you go click on the button that says white items. You're in the quilt covers section. You want white items, you want cotton, and you want really cheap. Now, depending on the order that you actually visited those or clicked on those things in, a lot of e-commerce platforms will simply give you a different URL. And it's serving the same content, but because it's got a different URL, it'll look different to Varnish. And that's where this query string sort comes in. Essentially, Varnish can make it look the same to, Varnish can interpret this to be the same content. So you get a higher hit rate, which is great. And it was such a popular plugin that it actually became part of Varnish in the latest version. So, where to from here? Everything so far has been on the server side. And the server side, like I discussed right at the start, was only concerned with the time to first byte. There's still the whole rest of the web page that needs to load. So, this is a bit of a truism, but the fastest request you make is one you don't have to make at all. If you can have content that's cached on the client's browser, then they don't have to do anything. They don't have to make a request. So, this is the second part of my talk, which now focuses on client-side caching and why it is important. So, again, we're back to our old friend webpagetest.org. And client-side caching is largely concerned with static assets. And that includes everything from images to CSS and JavaScript. So, what this really boils down to is that you need to have your web server set up correctly. That's what it comes down to. And that means that static assets will have the HTTP headers set properly so that your browser knows how long it can cache items for. And it's surprising really to see how many websites aren't configured right. And because your browser doesn't know that it can cache it, it errs on the side of caution and simply downloads it again. So if you actually get this client-side caching set up properly, it has a few benefits. The main benefit is that your site will feel faster because the content is instantly loaded because it's already in the client's browser. Also, it'll avoid the problem where sometimes content seems to pop, like especially if the CSS, for example, wasn't downloaded and cached. Then maybe as they click around your site, going from page to page, it'll have to re-download the CSS, and that means that for a brief moment, every page load, your web page won't be styled properly with the CSS. So if we can make sure that all that is cached in the person's browser, then it'll make the website feel faster. The other thing is that it saves bandwidth because the web browser doesn't have to download everything again. This is especially important when it comes to images. You want to definitely make sure that your images have a long expiry time set. And for a lot of people it can be really, like this is basic stuff, but it's surprising to see how many websites don't do it right. And it's worth checking. And yeah, browsers can quickly check to see if something has been updated. It's a lot easier for them to send a, has this been modified since request than, send me the image again. It could save, it could add up to, terabytes of bandwidth if you were a pretty big site. So another thing to consider is if we work together with content distribution networks, essentially because everyone's using the same stuff as far as JavaScript goes, it's very difficult to find a website these days that isn't using something like jQuery. A lot of the different CMS frameworks are using common JavaScript libraries. And honestly, in this day and age, there's no real point to hosting your own copy of that content. So people like Google, or companies like Google, have set up various CDNs that you can use that just host a copy of that library. They have all different versions of it, so you can simply replace your link to jQuery.js with a link to Google's one. The reason why I said we have to work together for this is if everyone does that, then it means it's already going to be likely cached in the client's browser. So they can already have the bulk of the JavaScript downloaded and cached before they even visit the website. So, a very common thing that a lot of people would ask during web development is when they're dealing with things that are cached, they often ask, have you tried refreshing? Have you tried, hard refreshing, Control F5, Command F5 and all that, to make sure that the latest content is showing up in the browser. And see, Control F5 basically tells the browser, hey, I want you to definitely grab the latest version of this, don't rely on your cache. So you can stop this from happening if you use a technique called cache busting. Cache busting is essentially putting a fingerprint on each asset, like JavaScript or CSS or images. Generally, this is like a timestamp or a unique hash. That way, when you make a change, it looks completely different because it's got a different URL, so the browser has to download the latest version. This also means that you can have the latest version have a really long expiry time, because this way not only is, like, if you're not making any changes, it will keep the long expiry time. And if you do make a change, well, it's changing its URL, so it's going to look different and get downloaded right away. So it's the best of both worlds if you can get cache busting working with static assets. So it all sounds like a lot of hard work, but there are a lot of techniques we can use to help us with this process. Sometimes it might not be feasible to easily add, add headers to items. Like, consider a website that generates images. You couldn't really have your web server easily add those headers to those images because it's going through your web application logic. Like, consider things like thumbnails or other dynamic images. In that case, you might want to intercept the fact that you're serving an image with Varnish, because Varnish sits between your application and the internet. So with Varnish, you have full control over any header that goes through for any item. So you can easily say, oh, look, this is a JPEG. I'll just make this expire in 2038. And it's easy. The other thing to look at is another project of Google called Mod PageSpeed. These days, it's available not only in the original incarnation, which is Mod PageSpeed for Apache, it's also available for Nginx. And it does a pretty good job of automating all of this optimization process. So the stuff I mentioned with making sure you've got the right expiry headers and cache busting set up, that's what PageSpeed can do automatically. But of course, there's a lot of magic going on under the hood, because the optimizations involved are often very complicated and might not necessarily be the right fit for your website. So if you're thinking about using something like PageSpeed, give it a trial, but don't rely on it. It's often better to get these processes right in the first place, rather than having to rely on an automated process to come along and fix it for you. So, to sum it up, with caching, both server-side and client-side, it can help you scale your website to tens of thousands, millions of hits per second. Varnish is an incredibly powerful piece of software, but the whole spiel about how with great power comes great responsibility, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally serve the wrong content to the wrong client. However, if you get it right, you will save your server a heck of a lot of processing time, because it can serve all the content from the cache, and it'll reduce the time to first byte significantly. So your clients will get a faster website and everybody's happy. As far as the client side goes, if you can get the headers set properly on all your static assets, then not only will your website appear to, it'll feel faster. If you're saving your server from having to retransmit images and JavaScript and CSS, it'll even save you on bandwidth costs, which is worth considering. Thank you. Any questions?
Varnish kind of reached sort of fanboy status 4 or 5 years ago. Can you compare and contrast the stats you get out of Varnish as opposed to Squid, which is kind of the classical caching system?
We haven't really used Squid that much. I think Squid's been around for a lot longer, and Squid was written as a general purpose cache. So it was not only designed as a reverse proxy, it was also designed for general caching, forward proxy. Varnish, however, was written with performance in mind from the ground up. And I don't know if it really reached the fanboyism about 4 or 5 years ago, because it's still under incredibly active development. Back then it would have still been Varnish 2 or something like that. They're up to Varnish 4 now, and more content's being added. They're even expanding it with things like being able to, one neat feature of Varnish 4 that might be worth mentioning is how it can actually serve even streaming videos from cache by using range headers and all that, but it's pretty crazy what it can do now. I don't have a direct comparison to Squid, but I would trust Varnish with the performance. Squid's a much more complex and an older beast compared to Varnish.
So I'm coming to it from a more of a dev perspective, minimal involvement with ops, but I can find my way around the server. What sort of time investment do you find you need to get Varnish up and running in a useful capacity? So if I'm looking at it for a brand new project, what's the overhead in trying to get started with it?
If it's a brand new project, it's often quite easy because you don't have to worry about disrupting a current production website.
Right.
As far as setting it up, it strongly depends on what framework you're using. If you're using something like WordPress, there's practically no setup time. Everything just works. You install the plugin, you point it to your Varnish server, you're done.
Right.
Everything will just work. Maybe 5 minutes of configuring. And by configuring it, I mean copying and pasting from...
Point and click kind of
Yeah. So for a small site or for a mostly read-only site like a blog, it can be pretty damn easy to set up. As far as things like Magento or other frameworks, if there is the hard work already done for you and the integration tools exist, it's usually pretty simple. But if it was like a bespoke project that you're just making with the latest and greatest Node.js or something, you might have a bit of trouble. And you'll likely have to work on the integration with Varnish yourself so you can get all the invalidation stuff working.
Right.
Most of the time spent with setting up Varnish is definitely in the testing. You might think that everything's working, and then you go to place a test order, and it doesn't work. Or you go to test some Ajax, and it doesn't work. And you have to work out, maybe I shouldn't be trying to cache that. Maybe I should pass it straight through to the backend, just for safety. So testing takes up the vast majority of the time. Apart from that, you could probably get it set up for most things in a couple of days if you really wanted to.
What happens when all the cache invalidates?
One thing you definitely want to avoid is flushing the cache, as they call it. You can imagine what would happen if you had a heavily loaded website and you've taken advantage of Varnish by having, weaker servers because most of it's being saved from the cache. So you might not necessarily have the grunt there in order to handle the load if suddenly that caching went away. So you've got to be quite judicious about not flushing the cache when you don't need to. This is where the cache invalidation becomes very important, because obviously if someone makes a change to one product, they only expect that one product to be updated. You don't want to restart Varnish or flush everything in the Varnish cache, because that means that everyone's going to have to hit the back end for a fresh request. So yeah, you don't want to invalidate everything. You want to try to avoid that.
You could try like staggering it, flushing different parts at a time.
So based on that then, Varnish holds its entire cache and runtime, it doesn't do any file system caching itself?
That's all configurable. You can actually get
Right.
Varnish to save the cache to the file system,
Yep.
but generally you want it to be in memory. RAM's cheap.
It is, but I'm also thinking it from a perspective of, I'm coming from a very large, heavily, many thousands of transactions kind of site. And from that perspective, we have to invalidate the cache on a page-by-page basis. You mentioned there that you don't want to come and restart Varnish, but does it have that support to be able to restart the service and reload a cache from the file system? Does it cache itself on the file system per se?
That's a tricky question because the idea of having a persistent backend for Varnish was actually floated as one of the major draw cards for Varnish 4.
Right.
It actually got, I'm sure it got funded by a company similar to what you're describing, where they wanted the ability to restart Varnish. And they were going on and on about how magical it was going to be that you could have the cache stored on disk, and then you could make a change to the Varnish configuration and restart Varnish, and only the parts that had to be chucked out could get chucked out. Everything else could be maintained. The trouble is the persistent backend that I'm describing here was rather buggy. It didn't really work so well. Honestly, there's no good answer these days to the persistent backend. They kind of stopped working on it so much because of all the problems they encountered. Apparently it would require a significant re-engineering of the whole way how Varnish is written in order to support that kind of functionality.
Yep.
And even then it would only be marginally useful for a few people, because the vast majority of people would be happy with leaving Varnish running all the time and then flushing everything. You don't have to restart it. Or you can just, flush, because Varnish is pretty powerful in the fact that although each page in the cache, depending on how you split things up into the Varnish cache, like you might say, I want everyone who visits on a mobile device to get a different copy. So one problem you can run into with Varnish is that if you have a mobile site and you have a regular site, and they're both served from the same URL, you don't want to run into the problem where you're serving the mobile site to a regular user. So the way how Varnish gets around this is by the concept of, essentially it hashes the content based on your rules that you configure it with into different buckets. So we can say mobile user agents go here and everyone else goes there, and we can keep them separate to ensure that we don't serve the wrong page to the wrong person. So that means that we can have control over the invalidation, because in the same way that we've split up the cache between different things, we can say, oh, I made a change but it only affects the mobile thing, so only invalidate the mobile pages. And Varnish is really flexible as far as that goes. As far as invalidation goes, you have a full management interface. You can send commands to Varnish to do really granular invalidation, like with regexes and everything. So it's great in that regard.
got one for you. If you're looking for quick wins to improve your site performance, is Varnish like the first place you look?
Varnish, I don't know, Varnish requires a lot of thought. Mostly the fact that caching can cause problems and every website is a little bit different. You want to make sure that you do testing. Setting up Varnish itself can be pretty quick and painless, but like I was saying before, the vast majority of the time comes from testing and confirming that the functionality still works as you expect. Varnish is more of an advanced topic as far as site performance goes. Generally, it's a better idea up to a point to try to fix the code, but there's always diminishing returns. Like, if your website currently takes 30 seconds to load, well, you got bigger problems. And Varnish can't help you with that. Well, it can, but not until you flush it, and then you're going to have to wait another 30 seconds. So, yeah, Varnish is more of an advanced thing. So I wouldn't pursue it as the first port of call, but it's definitely something that you need to look at if you're planning on scaling up, or if you're expecting a big sale or something like that, a lot of traffic.
So, you know how they had that shopping one, Click Frenzy? What happened there? Why did they fail?
They didn't use Varnish. They probably underestimated how much traffic they'd all get at the same time. I think part of that, the problem with that was the planning as well, because not only were they having lots of people hitting the site, they were having lots of people hitting the site at the exact same time, which is a recipe for disaster. These days, I believe they use Akamai to handle the, essentially Akamai or other CDNs like that perform functionality similar to Varnish. So it's still the same kind of idea. They have a cache down.
Had the wrong service provider. So.
Well, they did switch, yeah.
Yeah, they had to switch. It was actually the service provider.
Perhaps not to take offline, but I'm really curious as to your thoughts on using Varnish in environments where you are continually deploying new cloud-based solutions. So a couple of, especially in the startup space, people spinning up brand new AWS services and spinning down the old ones as they deploy every single time, so their entire infrastructure is tracked. You said Varnish is not so good when you want to restart the service or bring it up another machine. Has it started to fit into that stack at all in recent times, or is it still needing its own dedicated little box off to the side?
Although in the way that we normally deploy it these days, we typically set up Varnish on the same server as the web server. So, like you were describing there, while you might have multiple front ends, you don't necessarily have to have Varnish on the same server as each of the front ends. So if you were spinning up and spinning down things through, the Elastic Cloud and all that, you don't need to have Varnish on each server, because obviously when you spin up Varnish, it's going to have a cold cache. There's no point in that. So you can have, there's nothing stopping you from simply having Varnish on another server, or having multiple Varnish servers. You might have all of your web servers on EC2 instances, and then you might have a few larger EC2 instances that are running Varnish, and they can all talk to each other. Because of course you can have a Varnish listening to another Varnish and all that, and it works great. So, he's already got it.
You got to help.
He couldn't resist the call for pizza.
Yeah, pizza is more important than beer.
Cool.
So that's it.
Give it up for Mike. Interactive ones that we had, which is really good. I want to thank Peter and Stephen for the lightning talks, and Michael again for the presentation, and Anchor for any other sponsors for the beer and pizza. Remember to check out the Port80 meetup group and the social media websites. Also, if you have any further information or questions, please see myself, Chloe, or Jess, Bart, in regards to our next meetup group, so what's going on. Also, please note,